What if I told you that the most dangerous man in a city of killers was the one who refused to kill? That the most powerful criminal in a world built on violence was the one who preached peace? This is not a parable. It is a paradox that walked the streets of Philadelphia for nearly 5 decades. A man whose life and brutal death would become a permanent stain on the history of the American Mafia. Before we descend into his world, a world of whispered deals and sudden betrayals, it is crucial to state that the story you are about to hear is a synthesis of facts gathered from a multitude of sources. Declassified FBI files, federal court transcripts, testimonies from informants, and the works of historians and journalists who have pieced together this complex puzzle. The sole intention is to present to you, the listener, a comprehensive and accurate narrative, separating the man from the myth and understanding the intricate web of circumstances that led to his shocking end. Our purpose is education through storytelling. If you are ready to explore this dark chapter of history, please take a moment to support this channel by liking this video and subscribing for more deep dive content into forgotten tales of the past. Now, close your eyes and let the story pull you back in time to the very beginning, not in America, but on an ancient island far away. Our story starts not with the man, but with the myth, the fertile ground from which he grew. Angelo Bruno was born Angelo Annaloro on a warm spring day, May 21, 1910, in the small, rugged Sicilian town of Villalba. To understand the man he would become, one must first taste the air of Villalba, feel its hard, sun-baked earth underfoot, and sense the weight of its centuries-old traditions. Sicily is more than an island. It is a fortress of the mind, a place perpetually conquered, but never truly subdued by foreigners. Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Normans, Spaniards. From this turbulent history, the Sicilian people forged an unbreakable code. Trust no one outside the family. Settle your own disputes, and never ever speak to the authorities. This was Omert, the law of silence. Not written in any book, but etched into the soul of every child born there. It was a code born of necessity, a way for the powerless to exert a sliver of control in a world stacked against them. In Villalba, everyone knew everyone, and loyalties were as deep and tangled as the roots of the olive trees. The Annaloro family was part of this tight, knit fabric, and young Angelo absorbed these lessons not as instruction, but as instinct. He learned that a man's worth was measured by his respect, his word, and his ability to provide for and protect his own. But like so many thousands of Sicilian families at the time, the Annaloros saw the limits of that protection. Poverty was a relentless shadow, and the promise of El America shone like a distant, blinding star. The decision was made. They would cross the ocean. The journey was a rite of passage, a terrifying leap of faith into the unknown. They arrived at Ellis Island, that great, teeming gateway. Their name perhaps simplified by a harried immigration officer, their future a blank page. They settled, like so many of their countrymen, in South Philadelphia, a vibrant, noisy, and crowded neighborhood that was a world unto itself. It was here that the old world met the new, where the Sicilian dialects mixed with the sounds of American industry, and where the ancient code of Omert would be tested against the ruthless opportunities of a modern, booming, and often lawless nation. The streets of South Philly in the 1920s were a crucible for a young, intelligent, and observant boy like Angelo. It was a university of the streets. He saw the successful gangsters, the big men who commanded respect, wore fine clothes, and seemed to answer to no one. He also saw the poverty and desperation that drove others to crime. He understood early on that there was a hierarchy, an invisible government that operated alongside the official one. He was a quiet boy, not given to flashy displays or reckless violence. He was a listener, a watcher. He learned English, did well in school, but his real education was happening on the corners and in the social clubs. He saw how disputes were settled, how favors were granted, and how loyalty was rewarded and betrayal punished. He began running small errands for the local figures, not as a thug, but as a reliable messenger, a kid who could be trusted to keep his mouth shut. His reputation for being calm, thoughtful, and discreet did not go unnoticed. In the chaotic and often brutal world of Prohibition-era gangsterism, these were valuable traits. While others sought fame and flash, Angelo Bruno sought something far more durable: influence. He was being groomed, not for a life of street-level chaos, but for a role that required patience, strategy, and an understanding of the long game. He was learning the business of crime, and he was proving to be a natural. The boy from Villalba was becoming a man of Philadelphia, and his journey from the periphery to the very center of power was about to begin. The Roaring Twenties in America was an era defined by a single, monumental law: prohibition. The Volstead Act, which banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages, did not stop people from drinking. It simply handed the entire, immensely lucrative industry over to men who operated in the shadows. For the smart and ambitious young men of neighborhoods like South Philadelphia, Prohibition was not a moral crusade, but a golden opportunity. It was during this turbulent time that Angelo Bruno, now in his late teens, truly came into his own. He didn't start as a boss or even a feared enforcer. His genius lay in his understanding of logistics, relationships, and quiet efficiency. While other gangs waged bloody wars over turf in the streets, Angelo was learning the art of the deal in the back rooms. He became associated with the rising power in the Philadelphia underworld, Salvatore Sabella, but Angelo's role was often that of a diplomat and a facilitator. He understood that the real money wasn't just in moving bottles, it was in controlling the supply chains. From the rum-running boats that slipped past the Coast Guard to the distribution networks that supplied the thousands of speakeasies that had sprung up across the city. He built connections that would last a lifetime, not with a gun, but with a handshake and a reputation for being a man of his word. He forged crucial alliances with the powerful New York families, particularly the Gambino family, then under the sway of the ambitious Carlo Gambino. This relationship with New York would become a cornerstone of his entire philosophy, and eventually a point of contention with his own more volatile crew. Angelo saw the bigger picture. He understood that Philadelphia, nestled between the major ports of New York and Atlantic City, was perfectly positioned to be a hub, a transit point for illicit goods that required cooperation, not conflict. This belief in peaceful coexistence and profitable alliances became his trademark. It was during this period that he officially became Angelo Bruno, shedding the surname Annaloro, a symbolic step into his new American identity as a businessman of the night. When Prohibition ended in 1933, many gangsters were thrown into disarray. Their primary revenue stream suddenly dried up. But for a strategist like Bruno, it was merely a shift in the market. He smoothly transitioned the organization's operations into other ventures: illegal gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering. He understood that vice was eternal, only the products changed. His calm, unassuming demeanor was his greatest asset. He didn't look like a gangster. He looked like a shopkeeper or an accountant. He lived quietly with his wife, Sue, and avoided the flashy, high-profile lifestyle that attracted so much police attention to figures like Al Capone in Chicago. He believed that the best way to wield power was to be invisible, to be the man who pulled the strings without anyone seeing his hands move. He rose through the ranks steadily, patiently, under the leadership of Joseph Ida, who succeeded Sabella, through the 1940s and 1950s, as the National Crime Syndicate, often called the Commission, solidified its power. Bruno's star continued to rise. He was respected on a national level, a delegate from Philadelphia who could sit at the table with the likes of Vito Genovese and Meyer Lansky and command respect. He was a consistent moneymaker, and more importantly, he was reliable. He didn't cause problems. He didn't start wars. He was a voice of reason and moderation in a room full of volatile egos. When Joseph Ida was forced to flee to Italy in 1959 to avoid prosecution, the succession was almost natural. The family, and more importantly, the Commission in New York, saw in Angelo Bruno the ideal leader for the Philadelphia family. He was a known quantity, a peacemaker, a master of the low-profile, high-profit approach. In 1959, Angelo Bruno was officially named the boss of the Philadelphia crime family. He had achieved the ultimate position of power, not through a bloody coup, but through decades of quiet, calculated, and intelligent maneuvering. He was now the man of honor, the boss. And he would rule his kingdom with a philosophy that was as revolutionary as it was, in the end, doomed. He would try to prove that in the cutthroat world of the American Mafia, a gentle Don could not only survive, but thrive. The coronation of Angelo Bruno as boss in 1959 marked the beginning of what would later be nostalgically referred to by some of his loyalists as the quiet years. It was an era of unprecedented stability for the Philadelphia and prosperity for the Philadelphia crime family, a direct result of Bruno's unique and disciplined philosophy. His first and most important rule was simple: avoid unnecessary attention. This meant no flashy murders, no public spectacles of violence, and a strict prohibition on dealing in narcotics. The drug trade, Bruno believed, was a triple curse. First, it attracted the most severe, and relentless form of law enforcement scrutiny from the federal government down. Second, the immense profits it generated inevitably bred greed, indiscipline, and internal power struggles. And third, it was a dirty business that preyed on the weak, bringing a level of moral opprobrium that even other criminal enterprises could avoid. This anti-narcotics stance was not born of morality, but of cold, hard business pragmatism. He had seen how heroin had torn apart other families, and he wanted no part of it. Instead, he doubled down on the traditional, softer rackets that had always been the mafia's bread and butter. The numbers racket, a city-wide illegal lottery, was a cash cow, a tax on hope in the city's poorest neighborhoods. Loan sharking, or shylocking, provided capital to those who couldn't get bank loans at exorbitant interest rates that generated massive, steady returns. Illegal gambling operations flourished, from backroom card games to sports betting. He also maintained a strong grip on several labor unions, which provided not only a source of revenue through embezzlement and extortion, but also immense political influence and the ability to paralyze the city's economy if needed. Bruno's genius was in his organizational structure and his approach to conflict resolution. He ran the family like a conservative CEO running a holding company. He allowed his capos, the captains who headed their own crews, a great deal of autonomy to run their own operations, as long as they kicked a percentage of their earnings up to the administration, and most importantly, stayed out of trouble. He was a mediator, not a tyrant. If two of his soldiers had a dispute, Bruno would summon them, hear both sides, and deliver a binding judgment. This prevented minor squabbles from escalating into bloody feuds. His connection to the Gambino family in New York was his shield. It was an understood fact in the underworld that moving against Angelo Bruno meant moving against Carlo Gambino, one of the most powerful and respected mafia leaders in the country. This alliance deterred external threats and gave Bruno immense credibility on the National Commission. He became a regular visitor to New York, attending meetings and social functions, always the picture of quiet, respectable power. His personal life was a mirror of his professional one. He lived in a modest row house in South Philadelphia, not a mansion in the suburbs. He was a family man, devoted to his wife Sue. He enjoyed his garden, he read, he played cards with a close circle of friends. To the outside world, and even to many within his own organization, he seemed to have achieved the impossible. He had created a stable, profitable, and sustainable criminal enterprise that operated like a well-oiled machine, all while maintaining a low profile that kept the heat from the police and the FBI at a manageable level. For nearly 2 decades, this system worked flawlessly. The money flowed, the peace held, and Angelo Bruno, the gentle dawn, was revered. But beneath this placid surface, tectonic pressures were building. A new generation was coming of age within the family, young, ambitious, and impatient men who looked at Bruno's cautious, almost passive style of leadership and saw not wisdom, but weakness. They looked at the drug trade, which was exploding in the 1970s, and saw billions of dollars left on the table because of an old man's outdated principles. They saw the burgeoning casino industry in Atlantic City, just an hour's drive away, as a new frontier ripe for the taking, and they grew restless under Bruno's deliberate negotiation first approach. The very stability he had created was breeding contempt among those who craved action, violence, and faster, flashier riches. The foundation of his 20-year reign, built so carefully on reason and restraint, was about to be shaken by the primal forces of greed and ambition that he had worked so hard to keep contained. The first major crack in the facade of Bruno's peaceful empire appeared not from within Philadelphia, but from the neon-lit shores of Atlantic City, New Jersey. In 1976, New Jersey voters approved a referendum to legalize casino gambling in Atlantic City, a desperate attempt to revive the faded resort town. For the American Mafia, this was akin to a new gold rush. Casinos meant unimaginable wealth, not just from skimming the profits, but from controlling the unions, the concrete supply, the line and services, the liquor distribution, and every other ancillary business that a casino required. It was a potential bonanza that made even the most disciplined mobsters salivate. Angelo Bruno, with his long-standing control over the Philadelphia, South Jersey corridor, was in the catbird seat. Atlantic City was essentially his backyard. His approach to this new opportunity was characteristically cautious, strategic, and, to his underlings, maddeningly slow. He didn't want a violent takeover. He envisioned a quiet, almost legalistic infiltration. He saw the chance to place his associates in key positions, to form partnerships with the legitimate developers who were pouring in, and to exert control from behind the scenes, just as he had always done in Philadelphia. He began making moves, but they were the moves of a chess master, not a street brawler. He held meetings. He discussed territorial agreements with other crime families, particularly the Genovese family of New York, which also had historical interests in New Jersey. He wanted everything done neatly, with the approval of the commission, to avoid a war. This deliberate pace, however, was interpreted as hesitation and a lack of ambition by his underboss, a ruthless and cunning man named Philip, Chicken Man, Testa, and more importantly, by his consigliere, Antonio Tony Bananas Caponegro. Caponegro was a stark contrast to Bruno. He was volatile, greedy, and deeply involved in the narcotics trade that Bruno forbade. He saw Atlantic City not as a long-term investment, but as a pie-ada to be smashed open and looted immediately. He grew increasingly frustrated with Bruno's methods, believing the boss was too subservient to New York, too timid, and was costing the family a fortune. The tension between Bruno's old world patience and Caponegro's new world avarice created a fault line that ran directly through the heart of the family. At the same time, another, more subtle threat was emerging, a young, ambitious, and notoriously violent capo named Nicodemo, Little Nicky. Scarfo was building a power base of his own. Scarfo, who ran the family's operations in Atlantic City, was a pure psychopath, a man who relished violence and ruled through sheer terror. He was everything Angelo Bruno was not. While Bruno settled disputes with words, Scarfo settled them with the .25 caliber pistol. Scarfo saw Bruno's peaceful ways as an embarrassment, a relic of a bygone era that needed to be swept away. He secretly aligned himself with the disgruntled Caponegro, forming a faction of malcontents who whispered in the shadows about the old man's inability to lead in a new, more aggressive criminal landscape. Bruno was likely aware of the grumblings, but he may have underestimated their intensity. He had been boss for so long, his authority so unquestioned for 2 decades, that he perhaps could not conceive of a direct challenge. He believed in the structure, in the rules of Cosa Nostra. He was a boss appointed by the commission, and according to the old codes that made him untouchable without their sanction. What he failed to grasp was that for men like Caponegro and Scarfo, those codes were just inconvenient obstacles. The lure of Atlantic City's billions was corrupting the very foundation of his rule. The gentle dawn was sitting on a powder keg of envy and ambition, and the fuse was already lit, burning its way from New York, where another powerful boss was growing impatient with Bruno's independent streak and his firm control over a territory that others coveted. The perfect storm was gathering, and its epicenter was the modest row house at 934 Snyder Avenue. The gathering storm that would ultimately consume Angelo Bruno found its most dangerous lightning rod in the figure of Antonio, Tony Bananas, Caponegro, a man whose very nickname spoke to a volatile and unpredictable nature. As the family's consigliere, Caponegro was supposed to be Bruno's trusted advisor, a voice of reason and a mediator of disputes. Instead, he had become the nucleus of the growing resentment against Bruno's rule. Caponegro was deeply enmeshed in the harrowing trade, a business that generated staggering profits, but which Bruno had explicitly and repeatedly forbidden. This created a constant, low-grade tension between the two men. Caponegro had to hide his most lucrative ventures from his own boss, and he chafed under this restriction, seeing it not as prudent policy, but as a personal insult and a limitation on his potential wealth. His greed was further inflamed by the opportunities in Atlantic City. He watched as Bruno methodically laid the groundwork for the family's entry into the casino world. But to Caponegro, it was all too slow, too legalistic. He wanted to muscle in, to extort the developers, to take over the unions by force, and to claim a huge, immediate share of the revenue. Every day that Bruno spent in negotiation was, in Caponegro's eyes, another day of lost millions. This festering discontent began to solidify into a concrete plot. Caponegro started having secret meetings with other disgruntled members of the family, including the young and vicious Nicodemo Scarfo in Atlantic City, and even sounding out feelings with underboss Philip Testa. The plot, however, faced an almost insurmountable obstacle: the commission. In the world of La Cosa Nostra, you could not simply murder a boss, especially one as well connected and respected as Angelo Bruno, without the express permission of the national ruling body. It was the ultimate sin, an act that would bring certain and severe retribution from the other families. Caponegro believed he had a solution to this problem. He decided to travel to New York to seek approval for the hit, essentially to get a contract from the commission itself. He believed he could make a convincing case. He would tell them that Bruno had lost his grip, that he was weak, that he was failing to maximize the family's profits from Atlantic City, and worse, that he was secretly skimming from the family's funds without sharing properly with his crew. A serious accusation of dishonesty. It was a desperate gamble, a journey into the lion's den. Caponegro first met with the powerful underboss of the Genovese family, Frank Funzi. Thierry, an old-school gangster, listened to Caponegro's complaints. The Genovese family had their own interests in New Jersey and may have seen Bruno's firm control as an impediment. Thierry was non-committal, but he didn't say no. Emboldened, Caponegro then sought an audience with the boss of the Genovese family, Frank Funzi, Thierry's superior, and potentially with members of the Gambino family. The historical record is murky on the exact conversations that took place, but the outcome would become terrifyingly clear. It is widely believed that Caponegro, either through miscommunication, deliberate deception by the New York bosses, or his own arrogant misinterpretation, left New York with the impression that he had received a green light, or at least that he would not face repercussions. Perhaps the New York families, particularly the Genovese, saw an opportunity. By allowing the unstable and predictable Caponegro to remove the stable and reliable Bruno, they could create chaos in Philadelphia. In that chaos, they could swoop in and grab a larger share of the Atlantic City action for themselves, dealing with a new, weaker, and indebted boss in Caponegro. It was a classic Machiavellian move. Let your enemy eliminate a formidable but independent rival, and then you eliminate the now weakened enemy. Caponegro, blinded by his own ambition and hatred for Bruno, walked directly into this trap. He returned to Philadelphia believing he had the blessing of the most powerful men in the underworld. The plot was now in its final stages. A team of hitmen was assembled. The target's movements were studied. Angelo Bruno, the man who had brought 2 decades of peace, was completely unaware that a death sentence, sanctioned by the very system he revered, had been placed upon his head. He went about his business as usual. A king who did not know his throne was about to be ripped out from under him in the most violent way imaginable. The clock was ticking down on the era of the gentle dawn, and the final seconds were to be counted not in days, but in hours. The night of March 21st, 1980 was unremarkable in most ways. It was a cool Friday evening in South Philadelphia. Angelo Bruno, then 69 years old, had spent the day like many others, attending to his various business interests, both legitimate and illegitimate. He had dinner with his wife, Sue, at their home at 934 Snyder Avenue, a residence that reflected his philosophy. It was comfortable, unassuming, and offered no outward sign of the immense power and wealth its occupant commanded. Later that evening, he received a visit from John Stanfa, a loyal and trusted soldier in his organization. Stanfa was a Sicilian immigrant, a Zips, as they were sometimes called, known for his fierce loyalty and old-school sensibilities. The 2 men had business to discuss, and they decided to continue their conversation in Bruno's car, a dark blue 1977 Chrysler New Yorker, which was parked at the curb directly in front of his house. This was a common practice for Bruno. The car was a mobile office, a private space where he could talk freely, away from potential listening devices. He sat in his customary spot in the front passenger seat, while Stanfa sat behind the wheel. The street was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. It was just after 9:30 p.m. Inside that car, Bruno and Stanfa were discussing the future, completely unaware that for Bruno, the future was now measured in minutes. Meanwhile, in the shadows, an execution squad was moving into position. The plan orchestrated by Antonio Caponegro was simple and brutal. A stolen car, a green Ford LTD, pulled up quietly behind Bruno's Chrysler. Inside were two hitmen. They approached Bruno's vehicle on foot. The scene that unfolded next was one of chilling efficiency and cold-blooded betrayal. As Bruno sat, likely relaxed and engaged in conversation with his associate, the passenger side window of the Chrysler suddenly exploded. A shotgun blast, fired at point-blank range, struck the gentle Don directly in the back of his head. The force of the blast was so tremendous that it nearly decapitated him. John Stanfa, sitting in the driver's seat, was sprayed with blood and brain matter, but was physically unharmed. He would later tell police that he heard no words, no warning, just the deafening roar of the shotgun and the shattering of glass. The hitmen, their primary task completed with one horrifically decisive shot, quickly retreated to their waiting car and melted away into the Philadelphia night. The entire event lasted mere seconds. The sound of the shotgun blast echoed through the quiet residential street, bringing neighbors to their windows and doors. What they saw was a scene of surreal horror. A luxury car with a shattered window, and inside, slumped against the dashboard, the lifeless body of one of the most powerful crime figures in America, his blood pooling on the pristine upholstery. The police and ambulances arrived quickly, but there was nothing to be done. Angelo Bruno was dead. The murder sent immediate shockwaves through the city and the national underworld. For the people of South Philadelphia, it was the end of an era. Bruno was a neighborhood fixture, a man known for his quiet charity and his aversion to flashy violence. His murder on his own doorstep, in such a brutal fashion, felt like a violation of an unspoken pact. For the national mafia, it was an earthquake. A sitting boss, a member of the commission, a man with direct ties to Carlo Gambino, had been assassinated without any public warning. The question on everyone's mind was not just who, but why, and more importantly, who had sanctioned it. The official investigation began immediately, but the Code of Omert ensured that witnesses were few and far between. The police found the stolen Ford LTD used in the hit a few blocks away, wiped clean of fingerprints. There were no immediate arrests. But in the underworld, the wheels of retribution were already beginning to turn. The murder of Angelo Bruno was not the end of the story. It was the violent, explosive beginning of a new and much bloodier chapter in the history of organized crime in Philadelphia. A chapter that would see the city descend into a gangland war of a ferocity it had never known under Bruno's reign. The peace was dead, and the age of the gentle dawn was over. replaced by the roar of a shotgun on a quiet spring night. In the immediate, stunned aftermath of the shotgun blast that killed Angelo Bruno, a deafening silence fell over the underworld. A silence thick with tension, fear, and the unspoken question of what would happen next. The public reaction was one of shock and morbid fascination. Headlines screamed about the mob hit, and the city held its breath, waiting for the inevitable retaliation. But within the insular world of La Cosa Nostra, the reaction was more complex, a mixture of outrage, calculation, and cold-blooded pragmatism. The first and most pressing issue was the question of sanction. Who had authorized the murder of a sitting boss? The rules of the Mafia were explicit. Such an action was the ultimate transgression, punishable by death, unless it was approved by the Commission. Antonio Caponigro, the architect of the murder, believed he had this approval, or at least a tacit understanding from the Genovese family in New York that they would not interfere. He saw himself as the new boss of Philadelphia by right of conquest. In the days following Bruno's death, Caponigro began acting as the de facto leader, holding meetings and making plans to take firm control of the family's operations, particularly the prized Atlantic City territory. He was confident, even arrogant, believing he had outmaneuvered the old man and was now stepping into his rightful place. However, he had fatally miscalculated the political landscape. The New York families, particularly the Genovese, had no intention of standing by him. In fact, they were already positioning him as the perfect scapegoat. The official story that began to circulate from New York was one of outrage and denial. They claimed that Caponigro had come to them with lies about Bruno, that they had given him no such approval, and that he had acted on his own, committing an unforgivable sin. This was almost certainly a lie, a calculated move to distance themselves from the fallout. By sacrificing the volatile and unreliable Caponigro, the New York bosses could appease the Gambino family, who were rightfully furious about the murder of their long-time ally Bruno, and simultaneously create a power vacuum in Philadelphia that they could exploit. The trap that Caponigro had walked into was about to snap shut with brutal force. Just over 2 weeks after Bruno's murder, on April 18, 1980, the grim price for his ambition was exacted. The body of Antonio, Tony Bananas, Caponigro, was found in the trunk of a car parked in the South Bronx, a location chosen to send a clear message that this was New York's justice. But his death was not a simple, clean execution. It was a savage and symbolic act of retribution, designed to communicate specific sins to anyone in the underworld who saw the body. Caponigro had been tortured. He was found with a large amount of cash stuffed into his mouth and his rectum, a clear message that he had been killed for his greed, for reaching for money and power that were not rightfully his. He had also been shot multiple times, and a single nickel had been placed in his hand. In the symbolic language of the Mafia, this was the ultimate insult. It signified that the hit on Bruno had been a cheap contract killing, worth only 5 cents, and that Caponigro himself was a cheap, worthless traitor. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens to those who break the rules. who murder a boss without the true, unequivocal sanction of the commission. The murder of Caponegro was not the end of the purges. His brother and fellow plotter, Alfredo, was also killed, and his body was found around the same time. The bloodletting had begun. With Caponegro eliminated, the question of succession in Philadelphia was now wide open. The natural heir, according to tradition, was the underboss, Philip, Chicken Man, Testa. Testa was a respected, old-school mafioso who had been loyal to Bruno. Though he had likely known about Caponegro's plot and had chosen to remain neutral, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. With the plot's failure and Caponegro's gruesome death, Testa emerged as the compromise candidate, the man who could restore a semblance of order. He was officially recognized as the new boss by the commission. But the Philadelphia family was now deeply fractured, its stability shattered. The era of peace was over, and a new, more violent leadership was about to take the helm, though its tenure would be tragically short-lived. The gentle reign of Angelo Bruno had ended, and the bloody scramble for his crown had just claimed its first major claimants, with many more to follow in the years of carnage to come. With the brutal elimination of Antonio Caponegro and his faction, Philip Chicken Man, Testa ascended to the throne of the Philadelphia crime family in the spring of 1980. He inherited an organization that was deeply traumatized, paranoid, and teetering on the brink of all-out war. Testa was a stark contrast to his predecessor, Bruno. Where Bruno had been a quiet diplomat, Testa was a hardened soldier, a man who had earned his nickname not from cowardice, but from a legendary ability to survive assassination attempts, seeming to have 9 lives like a cat. He was a product of the violent streets, not the quiet back rooms, and his leadership style reflected this. He understood that the family was now in a fight for its very survival, and he immediately began to consolidate his power, rewarding loyalty and purging any remaining sympathizers of the Caponegro plot. He promoted his own loyalists, most notably the young and ferociously ambitious Nicodemo, Little Nicky, Scarfo, making him a capo and solidifying his control over the family's increasingly vital interests in Atlantic City. Testa's brief reign, which would last less than 2 years, was marked by an aggressive and confrontational approach. He sought to project strength and re-establish the family's dominance, but in doing so, he alienated factions both inside and outside the organization. He was far more receptive to the narcotics trade that Bruno had shunned, seeing the immense profits as essential for rebuilding the family's coffers and financing the potential wars he saw on the horizon. This shift in policy opened the floodgates for a new generation of drug-dealing mobsters, further corrupting the family's traditional structure and attracting a different, more reckless kind of criminal. Externally, Testa's relationship with the New York families, particularly the Genovese, was fraught with tension. They viewed him as a temporary solution, a placeholder, and they deeply resented his attempts to aggressively reclaim all of the Atlantic City territory, which they had begun to encroach upon during the period of instability following Bruno's murder. Testa was not a man to negotiate from a position of perceived weakness. He pushed back, a move that was seen as arrogant and disrespectful by the more powerful New York families. This created a new set of enemies who began to see Testa not as a partner, but as an obstacle. Meanwhile, within his own inner circle, a new and even deadlier conspiracy was already taking root. Nicodemo Scarfo, the man Testa had promoted, was not a loyal subordinate. He was a pure sociopath who saw himself as the natural leader of the new, more violent Philadelphia family. He surrounded himself with a crew of like-minded young killers, including his nephew, Philip Frazee Phil Leonetti. Scarfo watched Testa's struggles with New York and judged him to be weak, believing that his aggressive posturing would ultimately lead the family into a disastrous war that they could not win. In Scarfo's twisted worldview, the only way to secure the family's future and its profits was through a reign of absolute terror, killing anyone who posed even the slightest threat, whether inside or outside the family. He began secretly plotting against his own boss, just as Caponegro had plotted against Bruno. Scarfo found a willing ally in another powerful capo, Frank Chicky Narducci, who also had his own ambitions and grievances with Testa. The stage was set for another violent transfer of power, proving that the cancer of betrayal, once introduced into the family's bloodstream by Caponegro, was now terminal. The end for Philip Testa came on March 15, 1981, a bleak Sunday evening. He was returning to his home on the 2100 block of Porter Street in South Philadelphia after visiting a social club. As he approached his front door, he stepped on a pressure plate hidden under the welcome mat. The device triggered a powerful bomb packed with nails and anti-personnel shrapnel, which exploded with devastating force. The blast was so powerful that it blew out windows in neighboring houses and hurled Testa's body into the street. He was killed instantly, his body mangled almost beyond recognition. The murder was a spectacle of violence, a public statement of ruthlessness that dwarfed even the hit on Bruno. The use of a bomb was a rare and audacious tactic, chosen for its terrifying psychological impact. It sent a clear message to the entire underworld. The old rules were gone, and a new, more savage era had begun. The Chicken Man had finally run out of lives, and waiting in the wings, ready to seize power from the bloody rubble, was Nicodemo, Little Nicky, Scarfo, a man who would transform the Philadelphia family from a profitable business into a murderous cult, plunging the city into the darkest chapter of its criminal history. The assassination of Philip Testa via a bomb on his own doorstep was more than just another mob hit. It was a declaration of war against the old order and the terrifying dawn of the Scarfo era. The man who stepped into the power vacuum was Nicodemo, Little Nicky, Scarfo, and his ascension to the throne of the Philadelphia crime family represented a complete and violent reversal of everything Angelo Bruno had stood for. Where Bruno was calm, Scarfo was hysterical with rage. Where Bruno sought peace, Scarfo reveled in war. Where Bruno ruled through respect and quiet influence, Scarfo ruled through pure, unadulterated terror. His physical stature, he was short, barely 5'5", belayed a bottomless capacity for violence. and he compensated for his size with a hyper-aggressive, paranoid, and murderous demeanor. He saw conspiracies in every corner and betrayal in every hesitant glance, and his solution to every problem, whether a multi-million-dollar business dispute or a perceived slight, was almost always murder. He immediately began to purge the family of anyone he deemed disloyal, unreliable, or simply not fanatically devoted to him personally. His inner circle became a tight, knit band of young, ruthless killers, most notably his nephew and underboss, Philip "Frazzy Phil" Leonetti, who shared his uncle's appetite for violence. Scarfo's base of operations was no longer the quiet streets of South Philadelphia, but the garish, booming landscape of Atlantic City. He moved into a penthouse apartment at the high-rise condominium known as the Sands Club, and from this glittering perch, he began to systematically loot the city. He dispensed entirely with Bruno's model of quiet infiltration. Instead, he and his crew engaged in a brazen campaign of extortion, strong-arming casino operators, construction companies, and union officials. If someone refused to pay, they were beaten, threatened, or killed. The body count began to rise at an alarming rate. Scarfo's reign was characterized by a level of bloodshed that was unprecedented even in the violent annals of the American Mafia. He ordered murders for the slightest reasons. A made man named Vinny Falcon, was killed for being disrespectful. Another Frank Chicky Narducci, who had conspired with Scarfo to kill Testa, was himself murdered because Scarfo began to suspect he was a potential rival. The family, which had been a profitable business under Bruno, was now being run like a homicidal cult. The revenue streams began to change as well. Scarfo enthusiastically embraced the narcotics trade, and his soldiers became major players in the heroin and methamphetamine markets, flooding the streets of Philadelphia and Atlantic City with poison. This brought a new level of law enforcement scrutiny, but Scarfo was indifferent. He believed that his willingness to kill anyone, including law enforcement informants, and even, it was rumored, prosecutors, would insulate him from justice. He created a climate of such intense fear that the Code of Omert, which had been a cultural tradition under Bruno, was now enforced at the barrel of a gun. To speak, even to a friend, was to risk a death sentence. The family's relationship with New York deteriorated completely. The powerful Gambino and Genovese families looked on with a mixture of contempt and alarm as Scarfo's chaotic and unpredictable reign destabilized the entire East Coast underworld. He was seen as a loose cannon, a mad dog who needed to be put down. But Scarfo, in his arrogance, believed he was untouchable. He flaunted his wealth, wearing expensive suits and flashing rolls of cash, a stark contrast to Bruno's deliberate anonymity. He held court in popular restaurants, holding loud, profanity-laced meetings in full public view, seemingly addicted to the notoriety. The quiet, calculated world of Angelo Bruno was a distant memory, replaced by a loud, bloody, and very public circus of death. The Philadelphia family was making more money than ever from drugs and extortion, but it was also hemorrhaging members to prison and to the morgue. The foundation was crumbling, and the very public, very violent reign of Little Nicky. Scarfo was creating a mountain of evidence that would eventually lead to his downfall and the near destruction of the organization Bruno had so carefully built and preserved for 2 decades. The storm that had begun with Bruno's murder had now escalated into a hurricane of blood, and there was no calm in sight. The descent into absolute madness under Nicodemo Scarfo was not a slow slide, but a precipitous plunge. A violent convulsion that seemed to consume the very soul of the Philadelphia crime family. The period from his ascension in 1981 through the mid-1980s can only be described as a reign of terror, a bloody purge where the family began to cannibalize itself with a ferocity rarely seen in organized crime. Scarfo's paranoia, fed by his own cocaine use and insatiable lust for absolute control, became the engine of destruction. He saw traitors everywhere, and his solution was invariably execution. The murders were no longer just business, they were personal, often driven by perceived slights and insults that festered in his mind until they could only be washed away with blood. One of the most infamous examples was the fate of Salvatore, Salvi Testa, the handsome, charismatic, and highly respected son of the murdered boss Philip Testa. Salvi was a rising star, a earner, and a decorated war hero from the family's battles, and for that very reason, Scarfo grew intensely jealous and suspicious of him. The young Testa's popularity was a threat. A series of minor misunderstandings and fabricated rumors, skillfully manipulated by other jealous members of Scarfo's inner circle, convinced the boss that Salvi was plotting against him. Despite Salvi's professed loyalty, Scarfo issued a death sentence on the son of his former benefactor. In September 1984, Salvi Testa was lured to a South Philadelphia storefront on the pretext of a meeting. As he walked in, he was ambushed and shot to death. The murder sent a chilling message through the ranks. No one was safe. Not the son of a former boss, not a valued earner, not anyone. Loyalty meant nothing. Only Scarfo's whim held any power. This pattern repeated itself again and again. The Rite Aid murders, the killing of a union official, the assassination of anyone who might pose even a hypothetical future threat. The list of victims grew long and bloody. Scarfo's methodology was brutally simple. He would identify a target, often based on the flimsiest of evidence or the whispered lies of sycophants. And then he would dispatch a team of shooters from his loyal crew, which included his nephew Philip Leonetti, Thomas Tommy Del Giorno, and Lawrence Yogi Merlino. The hit teams would carry out the executions with cold efficiency, and then report back to Scarfo, who would often celebrate the murders at lavish dinners, gloating over his power. He created a culture where murder was the primary management tool. This orgy of violence did not go unnoticed by law enforcement. The FBI and local police had been building cases against the family for years, but the sheer volume of killings under Scarfo provided a torrent of evidence and, more importantly, created immense pressure on those within the organization. The constant threat of death began to erode the code of omerta from the inside. Soldiers and even capos started to realize that their allegiance to Scarfo was a suicide pact. They were either going to be killed by him on a paranoid whim, or they were going to be sent to prison for life for the murders he was ordering. The fear of prison began to compete with the fear of Scarfo. The foundation of his power, terror, was now creating the very conditions for his downfall. The first major crack appeared with the defection of a key member of his inner circle. But it would not be the last. The pressure cooker was building, and the witnesses who would eventually bring down the entire regime were being created with every new body that fell. The family that Angelo Bruno had built on a foundation of stability and quiet profit was now a charnel house, and the stench of death was beginning to attract the one force that could ultimately dismantle it, the full, relentless weight of the federal government, armed not just with wiretaps, but with the terrified testimonies of the men who had once sworn to kill and die for Nicodemo Scarfo. The turning point. The moment when the bloody house of cards that Nicodemo Scarfo had built began to irrevocably collapse, came not from a dramatic shootout or a rival's plot, but from the slow, steady, and relentless pressure of the United States government. The FBI, which had monitored the Philadelphia family for decades, found its efforts supercharged by Scarfo's own reckless violence. Each new murder created a new crime scene, a new set of witnesses to be pressured, and a new thread for investigators to pull. The traditional methods of surveillance and wiretaps were now being supplemented by something far more powerful: the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICHO. This federal statute, a legal weapon of mass destruction designed specifically for organized crime, allowed prosecutors to target an entire criminal enterprise as a continuing criminal conspiracy. Under RICHO, they could connect the dots between the boss who gave the order, the underboss who relayed it, the capo who organized it, and the soldier who pulled the trigger, tying them all together into one overarching case that carried devastating, decades-long prison sentences. The first major breach in Scarfo's armor came from within his own inner circle, a clear sign that the climate of terror was becoming unsustainable for even his most hardened killers. The defector was Tommy Del Giorno, a high-ranking capo and a prolific hitman who had personally participated in numerous murders for Scarfo. Del Giorno was a brutal man, but he was also a pragmatist. He saw the writing on the wall. The constant killings were attracting unbearable heat, and he realized that it was only a matter of time before he was either murdered in one of Scarfo's paranoid rages or arrested and sent to prison for the rest of his life. Facing a lengthy prison sentence on a separate charge, Del Giorno made the calculated decision to break the sacred oath of Omert. In 1986, he approached the FBI and agreed to become a cooperating witness. His decision sent shockwaves through the organization. Del Giorno wasn't a low-level soldier. He was a made man, a trusted assassin who had broken bread with Scarfo and been privy to the most sensitive discussions of the family's leadership. He could provide direct eyewitness testimony about multiple murders, from the planning stages to the aftermath. He could detail the inner workings of the entire organization, its revenue streams, its structure, and its rituals. His cooperation was a catastrophic blow, but it was only the beginning. The floodgates were now open. The fear of being implicated by Del Giorno's testimony, combined with the terrifying prospect of RISO indictments, began to poison the loyalty of other key members. The culture of us against the world that Scarfo had tried to foster evaporated, replaced by a desperate, every man for himself scramble to avoid life in prison. The federal investigators, led by determined prosecutors, began to methodically build what would become the most comprehensive case ever assembled against an American Mafia family. They used Del Giorno's testimony to secure more wiretaps, which in turn captured incriminating conversations that corroborated his account. They followed the money, tracing the flow of cash from the extortion rackets in Atlantic City and the drug deals on the streets of Philadelphia, back to the family's leaders. They gathered forensic evidence from old crime scenes, re-interviewed witnesses who had been too terrified to speak before, and painstakingly constructed a timeline of murder and conspiracy that was as damning as it was extensive. Scarfo and his underboss, Philip Leonetti, along with nearly the entire upper echelon of the family, could feel the noose tightening. They grew even more paranoid, their conversations becoming more guarded, but it was too late. The machine of justice, once slow and plodding, was now moving with unstoppable momentum. The testimony of a man like Tommy Del Giorno was a prosecutor's dream. He could walk a jury through the dark heart of the organization, naming names, dates, and places, transforming abstract allegations into a vivid, horrifying narrative of criminality. The era of the gentle dawn was a distant, almost mythical memory, replaced by the stark reality of an organization on the brink of annihilation, not from a rival's bomb, but from the sworn testimony of its own most trusted killers, who had decided that saving themselves was a more compelling proposition than dying for the mad king who sat on a throne of skulls. The final act of the Scarfo reign began not with a bang, but with the quiet, methodical turning of the legal screws, a process that culminated in a series of indictments that were as sweeping as they were devastating. In 1987, the federal government unsealed a massive RISO indictment against Nicodemo Scarfo, his underboss and nephew Philip, Frazee Phil, Leonetti, and over a dozen other high-ranking members and associates of the Philadelphia crime family. The charges were a catalog of horrors that read like a dark history of the city itself. Multiple counts of murder, racketeering, extortion, illegal gambling, and narcotics distribution. The case was built on an unprecedented foundation of insider testimony. Thomas Del Giorno was the star witness, but he was not alone. The pressure exerted by the RISO statutes had created a cascade of cooperation. Other members of the organization, facing the grim reality of spending the rest of their lives in a maximum security prison, began to calculate their odds and decided that cutting a deal was their only hope. The trial that followed was a media circus and a landmark event in the fight against organized crime. For the first time, the inner workings of the Philadelphia mob were laid bare in a public courtroom. Not through speculation or police theory, but through the direct, chilling words of the men who had helped run it. Del Giorno and the other turncoats took the stand and, in calm, matter-of-fact detail, described a world of almost unimaginable brutality. They testified about the murders of Salvi Testa, Frank, Nicky, Narducci, and many others. They revealed how Scarfo would issue death sentences over minor slights, how he celebrated the killings, and how he controlled his empire through a constant campaign of terror. The prosecution presented a wealth of corroborating evidence, wiretapped conversations, financial records, and forensic reports that painted a consistent and damning picture. The defense, in contrast, was hamstrung. Their primary strategy was to attack the credibility of the cooperating witnesses, branding them as liars and murderers who were selling their testimony for reduced sentences. But this argument held limited power against witnesses who freely admitted their own horrific crimes. Their credibility bolstered by the cold, hard facts that supported their stories. The jury was presented with an inescapable conclusion. The organization, led by Nicodemo Scarfo, was a murderous criminal enterprise that had held the city hostage for years. The verdict, when it came, was a total victory for the prosecution. Scarfo, Leonetti, and their co-defendants were found guilty on all counts. The sentencing was equally historic. In 1988, Judge Franklin S. Van Antwerpen imposed the harshest sentences ever seen in a mob case up to that time. Nicodemo Scarfo was sentenced to life in prison, with an additional 55-year term to run consecutively, a sentence designed to ensure he would never again breathe air as a free man. Philip Leonetti received a 45-year sentence. It was the end of the line for little Nicky, Scarfo. The man who had believed that absolute terror was the ultimate form of power was now rendered completely powerless, a caged animal destined to die behind concrete and steel. His violent reign, which had lasted a mere 7 years, had resulted in over 24 murders and the near total destruction of the criminal organization he had sought to dominate. The conviction of Scarfo and his top lieutenants was more than just the fall of one man. It was the decapitation of an entire regime. The Philadelphia crime family, which had operated with impunity for decades under Bruno's quiet guidance, was now headless, its leadership either dead or facing de facto life sentences. The storm of violence that had begun with Bruno's murder in 1980 had finally subsided, not because the family had found a new peacemaker, but because the government had systematically dismantled its command structure. The streets of Philadelphia and the boardwalks of Atlantic City were, for the moment, quieter. But the story was not yet over. The aftermath of such a catastrophic downfall would create a new power vacuum, one that would lead to further struggles, more betrayals, and a desperate, bloody scramble for the ruins of the kingdom that Angelo Bruno had built and Nicodemo Scarfo had shattered. The convictions of Nicodemo Scarfo and Philip Leonetti did not magically restore order or usher in a new era of peace. Instead, they created a vast and dangerous power vacuum, plunging the remnants of the Philadelphia crime family into a chaotic and bloody civil war that would further decimate its ranks. With the top tier of leadership now permanently residing in federal penitentiaries. The question of who would control the shattered organization became a matter of life and death for those who remained. The two main contenders for the crumbling throne were John Stanfa, the old school Sicilian, born loyalist who had been sitting in the car with Angelo Bruno on the night of his murder, and Joseph, Skinny Joey, Merlino, the young, ambitious, and charismatic son of a former Scarfo underboss. This schism represented a fundamental clash of ideologies and generations. Stanfa was a traditionalist, a Zip who believed in the old Sicilian ways, a cautious and methodical operator who had the backing of the more conservative elements within the family, and, crucially, the tentative recognition of the Gambino crime family in New York, who saw him as a known quantity who could restore a semblance of stability. Merlino, on the other hand, was a product of the Scarfo era, but he represented a new kind of ambition. He was young, brash, and media savvy, seen as a modern gangster who understood the streets and had a loyal following among the younger, more aggressive members of the organization who were tired of what they saw as subservience to New York. Merlino believed the future of the family lay in asserting its independence and reclaiming its former glory through bold action. He and his faction, which included many of his childhood friends from South Philadelphia, viewed Stanfa as an outsider, a foreigner imposed upon them by New York, and they were unwilling to accept his leadership. The result was an internal war that was even more vicious and personal than the violence of the Scarfo years, because it pitted friend against friend and neighbor against neighbor. The streets of South Philadelphia became a free fire zone as the two factions engaged in a series of tit-for-tat assassinations and attempted hits. Drive-by shootings, car bombings, and brazen daylight executions became commonplace once again, shocking a city that had hoped the mob's influence was waning. Stanfa's faction, operating with a more structured, traditional approach, targeted Merlino's key allies. Merlino's crew, relying on street-level intelligence and sheer audacity, struck back with equal ferocity. The war was not fought over principle or a grand criminal vision. It was a raw, brutal struggle for the right to claim the hollow crown of a dying kingdom. The body count rose steadily throughout the early 1990s. The violence was so pervasive and so public that it once again drew the full, furious attention of law enforcement. The FBI, which had just successfully dismantled the top of the family, now found itself investigating a new, equally violent conflict from the ground up. The Stanfa Merlino War was a gift to federal prosecutors, as the constant killings provided a fresh wave of evidence and new opportunities to flip participants. The chaos and the ever-present threat of a bullet in the back of the head created an environment where loyalty was a luxury no one could afford. The same pressures that had cracked the Scarfo regime now began to work on the warring factions. Members on both sides, seeing their friends gunned down and facing the prospect of either being murdered by their rivals or arrested by the FBI, began to reconsider their options. The Code of Omerta, which had already been shattered by the testimony of Tommy Del Giorno and others, was now completely dead, a casualty of this internecine strife. The war for control of the Philadelphia family was not strengthening the organization. It was ensuring its final, utter destruction. It was a classic Greek tragedy playing out on the streets of South Philly. The very struggle to possess power was ensuring that the power itself would be annihilated in the process. The legacy of Angelo Bruno was now nothing more than a bloody prize to be fought over by two factions who, in their ruthless pursuit of dominance, were systematically destroying the last vestiges of the empire he had so carefully constructed. The brutal and seemingly endless civil war between John Stanfa and Joseph Merlino could not continue indefinitely. The sheer volume of violence and the intense law enforcement scrutiny it attracted ensured that a resolution, one way or another, was inevitable. That resolution came, as it had for Scarfo, not from a decisive military victory by either faction, but from the relentless, methodical power of the federal government. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, having learned invaluable lessons from the successful prosecution of the Scarfo regime, moved quickly to infiltrate and dismantle both warring camps. They used every tool at their disposal: sophisticated electronic surveillance, including hidden microphones in cars and social clubs, undercover agents who penetrated the outer circles of the organization, and most effectively, the continued application of the Rights Statute, which allowed them to treat the entire bloody conflict as one massive, continuing criminal enterprise. The first to fall was the Stanfa faction. John Stanfa, the old school Sicilian who had sought to bring order through traditional methods, found his world collapsing around him in 1994. A federal indictment charged him and his top associates with a litany of crimes, including murder, racketeering, and conspiracy. The evidence against him was overwhelming, largely gathered from secret recordings made in his own car. On these tapes, Stanfa could be heard discussing murders, ordering acts of violence, and detailing his criminal operations, providing a prosecutor's dream, a boss narrating his own guilt. The star witness at his trial was himself, his own voice coldly detailing his crimes. He was convicted and, like Scarfo before him, sentenced to multiple life terms in prison, effectively ending his bid for control and eliminating one half of the warring equation. With Stanfa gone, Joseph, Skinny Joey, Merlino and his faction emerged as the de facto victors by default. For a brief moment in the mid-1990s, it appeared that Merlino had achieved his goal. He was young, charismatic, and now the last man standing. He declared himself the new boss of the Philadelphia crime family and set about trying to rebuild. He embraced the spotlight in a way that would have horrified Angelo Bruno, becoming a local celebrity of sorts. Known for his flashy style, his frequent appearances in popular restaurants, and his reputation as a modern-day gangster, he attempted to modernize the family's operations, focusing on sophisticated gambling rings, insurance fraud, and shaking down nightclubs and bars. For a few years, it seemed as though a new, more stable era might be dawning. But the victory was illusory. The FBI had never taken its eyes off Merlino. His very notoriety made him a prime target. The The government had learned that decapitating one leadership structure was not enough. They had to prevent a new one from forming and solidifying its power. A massive, multi-year investigation was launched specifically targeting Merlino and his new administration. The FBI planted bugs in his headquarters, a social club on Broad Street. They monitored his every move, tracked his financial transactions, and cultivated informants within his inner circle. The world had changed since Bruno's day. The old methods of quiet, low-profile criminality were no longer possible under such intense and technologically advanced scrutiny. Merlino, for all his street smarts and ambition, was operating on a stage where every exit was watched and every conversation had the potential to be recorded. The foundation of his brief reign was built on sand, and the tide was coming in. The pressure was immense and unrelenting. The constant surveillance, the fear of indictment, and the lingering trauma of the recent war created a pervasive sense of paranoia. The trust that had once been the glue of the organization, even during the violent Scarfo years, was now completely evaporated. No one knew who they could talk to, who might be wearing a wire, or who might be cutting a secret deal with the prosecutors to save themselves. The Philadelphia family was a phantom of its former self, a hollowed out shell being patiently and meticulously prepared for its final dismantling. The reign of Joseph Merlino would not be defined by a glorious restoration, but by the inevitable, crushing weight of the federal indictment that was slowly, surely, being prepared against him. An indictment that would seek to finally put an end to the long, tragic story of the Philadelphia mob. The inevitable end for Joseph, Skinny Joey. Merlino arrived not with the dramatic flair of a street shootout, but with the quiet, bureaucratic finality of a sealed indictment. In 1999, the federal government unveiled a massive racketeering case against Merlino and his entire new administration. A case that was the culmination of a multi-year investigation that had employed every modern tool of law enforcement. The charges were a familiar litany of mob crimes: racketeering, illegal gambling, extortion, and loan sharking. But the evidence was more sophisticated than ever. The prosecution's case was built on a foundation of hundreds of hours of secretly recorded conversations, captured by bugs planted in Merlino's social club and in the cars of his associates. These recordings provided an intimate, real-time look into the operations of the rebuilt family, capturing Merlino discussing criminal schemes, settling disputes, and managing his crew. But the most devastating blow came from the testimony of those closest to him. The Merlino investigation saw an unprecedented number of high-level defections, a clear sign that the bonds of loyalty had been irreparably broken by decades of war and the terrifying prospect of righteous sentences. The most significant turncoat was Merlino's own underboss and childhood friend, Stevie Mazzone. Mazzone's decision to cooperate with the government was a catastrophic betrayal that struck at the very heart of Merlino's organization. If a man who had grown up with him, who had stood by him through the bloody civil war with Stanfa, could break the oath of Omert, then no one was safe and no loyalty was sacred. other key capos and soldiers also chose to become government witnesses. Their testimony, providing a detailed roadmap of the family's activities and directly implicating Merlino in its crimes. The trial, which began in 2001, was a spectacle that captivated the city. It was portrayed as the final chapter in the long and violent history of the Philadelphia mob. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence: the wiretaps, the financial records, and the devastating testimony of former friends. The defense, as in the Scarfo trial, attempted to paint the cooperating witnesses as liars and murderers who were trading their testimony for freedom. But the strategy was less effective this time. The sheer volume of evidence, particularly the audio recordings, made it difficult for the jury to dismiss the case as mere fabrication. However, the government's case was not without its weaknesses. Despite the overwhelming evidence of Merlino's leadership in a criminal organization, prosecutors struggled to directly connect him to the most serious acts of violence, the murders that had defined the previous eras. The jury, after a lengthy deliberation, found Merlino guilty on multiple counts of racketeering, but they deadlocked on the most serious charges, including murder. It was a partial victory for the government and a partial reprieve for Merlino. He was convicted and, in 2001, sentenced to 14 years in federal prison, a significant term, but far from the life sentences that had been handed down to Scarfo and Stanfa. For the federal authorities, it was a success. They had once again toppled the leadership of the Philadelphia family and put its boss behind bars. For Merlino, it was a defeat, but not the total annihilation that his predecessors had faced. He remained a figure of fascination, a symbol of the mob's lingering allure, even from his prison cell. His conviction, however, marked a definitive end to any notion of a resurgent, powerful Philadelphia crime family. The organization had been decimated by decades of internal warfare and relentless federal prosecution. It was now a shadow of a shadow, its ranks depleted, its influence minimal, and its once feared name reduced to a subject for history books and true crime documentaries. The era of the dominant, city-controlling mob boss was over. The long, tragic arc that had begun with the peaceful reign of Angelo Bruno had finally, it seemed, reached its terminus in a federal courtroom, with the son of the old guard being led away in handcuffs, his empire revealed to be little more than a fragile illusion, constantly observed and easily broken by the overwhelming power of the state. The imprisonment of Joseph Merlino in the early 2000s created what appeared to be a permanent void in the leadership of the Philadelphia crime family, a void that seemed to signal the final, whimpering end of an organization that had once commanded fear and respect across the nation. For years, the family existed in a state of suspended animation, a ghost of its former self, with no clear boss and no centralized authority. Its remaining members, those who had avoided prison or death, operated as small, independent cliques focusing on low-level street crimes, neighborhood gambling, small-scale loan sharking, and minor drug dealing. But they lacked the power, the influence, and the ambition to operate as a cohesive criminal corporation. the great rackets that had built the fortunes of Bruno and even Scarfo, the control of unions, the infiltration of major industries, the systematic extortion of large businesses were now far beyond their reach. The world had changed dramatically. Globalized crime syndicates from Russia, Asia, and Latin America had moved into territories once dominated by the Mafia, and they operated with a level of brutality and transnational reach that the parochial American mob could not match. Law enforcement tactics had also evolved beyond the wildest nightmares of the old Duns. The FBI's focus had expanded to include counter-terrorism, but its organized crime division now had access to technologies that made the wiretaps of the 1980s look primitive. Digital surveillance, data mining, and financial tracking made it nearly impossible to build a large-scale criminal enterprise without leaving a pervasive digital footprint. The Code of Omerta was not just broken, it was obsolete, a relic from a time when trust was enforced with a gun and not constantly undermined by the possibility of a hidden microphone or a flipped smartphone. In this new landscape, the very model of the traditional, hierarchical Mafia family seemed anachronistic, a dinosaur unable to adapt to a new ice age. The younger generation in neighborhoods like South Philadelphia saw little glamour in the mob life. They saw a legacy of early graves and long prison sentences. The romanticized image of the gangster had been replaced by the grim reality of righteous indictments. For more than a decade, the Philadelphia family was leaderless and adrift, a collection of aging soldiers and opportunistic small-timers. Their activities so fragmented and low-level that they barely registered on the radar of federal prosecutors who were now focused on more pressing threats. It was during this period of extended dormancy that the story of the Philadelphia mob seemed to have reached its natural conclusion. The fiery chaos of the Scarfo era and the bitter civil war that followed had burned the organization down to its roots, and the soil seemed too poisoned for anything new to grow. The name Angelo Bruno was a distant memory, a figure from a different century, and the violent passions that had once consumed his successors had cooled into the dull, mundane reality of street-level crime. The empire was gone, and all that remained were a few scattered tribes squabbling over the ruins, unaware that the world had moved on and left them behind. This long interregnum, this silence from the once powerful family, was the strongest evidence yet that the American Mafia, as a dominant force in organized crime, was finished, a victim of its own internal pathologies and the relentless, efficient pressure of a modern justice system that had learned how to dismantle it piece by piece until nothing of substance remained, yet, like a phantom limb, the sensation of the Philadelphia crime family never completely disappeared, and in the second decade of the 21st century, it manifested once more in a way that both echoed the past and confirmed its irreversible decline. Joseph Skinny Joey Merlino, after serving the majority of his 14-year sentence, was released from prison in 2011. His return to South Philadelphia was not the triumphant homecoming of a conquering king, but the re-emergence of a spectral figure from a bygone era. He was older, but the charisma and the notorious reputation remained, making him an immediate focal point for both the remnants of the old guard and the intense, unblinking gaze of federal law enforcement. Merlino did not, and likely could not, attempt to rebuild the traditional, hierarchical family structure of the past. Those days were over. Instead, he operated as a free agent godfather, a revered but somewhat detached figure who was consulted on disputes and received tribute from various independent criminal crews, but who no longer exercised day-to-day command over a vast criminal empire. He became a regular presence in South Florida as well, dividing his time between Philadelphia and Boca Raton, a geographic shift that itself signaled a move away from the gritty street-level control of the old days. He was seen as the boss, in name and in reputation, but his actual power was a faint echo of the absolute authority wielded by Bruno or even the tyrannical Scarfo. The federal government, however, had no intention of allowing even this diminished version of the mob to operate with impunity. Merlino was, and always would be, public enemy number one in the eyes of the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force in Philadelphia. They began a new, painstaking investigation, aiming to build a case that would put him away for life. This new investigation, however, faced a challenge. The classic mob crimes of murder and extortion were no longer Merlino's primary focus. To ensnare him, the government had to adapt, and they did so by targeting him in a sprawling, multi-state health care fraud scheme. The indictment that came down in 2016 was a sign of the times. Merlino and associates from New York and New England were accused of running a sophisticated scam that involved bribing doctors to prescribe unnecessary compounded medications, which were then billed to union health plans for exorbitant, inflated prices. This was a far cry from the street corner numbers rackets and union hall extortion of Bruno's day. It was a white-collar crime, complex and digital, yet it was still, in the government's view, a racketeering enterprise. The trial, held in New York, was a complex affair, focusing on financial records and intricate schemes rather than the bloody testimony of hitmen. In a stunning outcome that underscored the government's difficulty in pinning modern crimes on an old, school target, Merlino was acquitted on the most serious charges. It was a significant victory for him, a defeat for the prosecutors, and it seemed to cement his status as a Teflon Don for the new millennium. He was convicted on a minor charge related to illegal gambling, for which he served no additional prison time. For a moment, it appeared that Merlino had finally outmaneuvered the system that had spent decades trying to destroy him. He was free, a living legend, a symbol of the mob's stubborn, if greatly diminished, persistence. But this victory was as illusory as the power he now wielded. He was free, but he was perpetually watched. His every move was monitored, his every association documented. He was the boss of a memory, a figurehead for an organization that existed more in the public imagination than in criminal reality. The release of the once feared Nicodemo, Little Nicky, Scarfo from prison in 2019, a frail and dying old man, served as a stark, bookend reminder of the inevitable fate that awaited all who pursued this path. Scarfo's freedom was brief and meaningless. He had spent the heart of his life in a cage, and he died a free man in name only. The circle was now complete. The violent young prince who had destroyed Bruno's legacy was gone, and the man who represented its last. Faint echo, Joseph Merlino, was a free man, but a king without a kingdom, ruling over a graveyard of his predecessors' ambitions. To truly understand the fall of the Philadelphia crime family, one must look beyond the bullet, riddled bodies, and the sensational trials, and instead examine the slow, corrosive decay of its very soul, the principles that had allowed it to exist and even thrive for a time. The story of the family is a tragic opera in 3 acts, each defined by a boss whose philosophy ultimately contained the seeds of his own destruction. The first act belonged to Angelo Bruno, the gentle Don, whose reign was a masterpiece of stability and low-profile profit. His principle was peace, cooperation, and the avoidance of attention. He understood that the greatest threat to a criminal enterprise was not a rival gang, but the focused wrath of the state. For 2 decades, this principle worked brilliantly. The family was wealthy, powerful, and operated with a remarkable degree of impunity. But Bruno's principle contained a fatal flaw. It relied on the patience and discipline of those who served under him. In a world populated by greedy, ambitious, and violent men, his pacifism was eventually perceived as weakness. His refusal to embrace the narcotics trade and his deliberate pace in Atlantic City created a reservoir of resentment that his underboss and consigliere, men who lacked his long-term vision, were all too willing to tap into. Bruno's murder was not just a hit. It was the violent rejection of his entire worldview. The second act was the reign of Nicodemo Scarfo, a direct and brutal refutation of everything Bruno stood for. Scarfo's principle was absolute terror. He believed that if he could make himself and his regime more feared than the government, he could operate with total freedom. He sought to control his men not through shared prosperity and respect, but through the constant, paralyzing fear of a sudden and violent death. This principle worked in the short term, creating a tightly controlled, if homicidal, organization. But its flaw was even more profound than Bruno's. A rule of pure terror is inherently unstable. It creates an environment of such intense paranoia that it inevitably turns inward, consuming its own. It also guarantees the full, relentless attention of law enforcement, as the sheer volume of violence provides a constant stream of evidence and motivation for investigators. Scarfo's principle was a self-destruct mechanism, and it worked exactly as designed, leading directly to the courtroom where his own voice and the testimony of his terrified subordinates buried him. The third act, the era of civil war and the diminished reign of Joseph Merlino, was defined by a new principle: survival in a post-apocalyptic landscape. After the scorched earth policies of Scarfo and the devastating prosecutions that followed, the family was a hollowed-out shell. Merlino's principle was charisma and brand recognition. He was selling the idea of the mob, the mythology, because the substance was largely gone. He was a celebrity gangster in an age where the traditional structures of organized crime were collapsing. The flaw here was that this model had no real power. It attracted law enforcement attention without the corresponding criminal revenue to sustain a defense. It was a performance, and while it kept Merlino in the spotlight, it could not rebuild the empire. The family's downfall was therefore not a single event, but a cascading failure of philosophy. Bruno's peace was too passive for the wolves in his midst. Scarfo's terror was too volatile and attracted the hunters. Merlino's nostalgia was too insubstantial to build anything new. Each boss, in his own way, proved uniquely unsuited to the challenges of his time. And their collective failures ensured that the organization would be ground into dust between the millstones of internal betrayal and external prosecution. The Code of Omert, the sacred vow of silence, was the spiritual core of this world, and it was the first thing to die. It was murdered not by the FBI, but by the mob itself, first by the betrayers like Caponegro, then by the tyrant Scarfo, who made cooperation seem like the only path to survival, and finally by the pragmatists of the modern era, who saw a deal with the government as a simple business decision. The family was not defeated from the outside in. It rotted from the inside out, a victim of its own corrupted values and the inability of its leaders to impose a sustainable, rational criminal order in a world that was rapidly changing and increasingly intolerant of their very existence. The legacy of Angelo Bruno and the Philadelphia crime family is a complex and haunting one, a permanent scar on the city's history that serves as a dark lesson in the nature of power, loyalty, and the inevitable consequences of a life lived outside the law. For the city of Philadelphia itself, the mob's reign left an indelible mark, a lingering shadow in the narrow streets of South Philadelphia and the glittering casinos of Atlantic City. The physical locations, the quiet row house on Snyder Avenue, the social clubs now shuttered or repurposed, the street corners where deals were made and hits were carried out, stand as silent monuments to a violent past. For decades, the mob's influence seeped into the city's bloodstream, corrupting unions, intimidating businesses, and twisting the political process to its own ends. It created a climate of fear and complicity, where looking the other way was often the safest course of action. The descendants of those neighborhoods still carry the stories, a mixture of revulsion and a strange, twisted pride in the notoriety that their streets produced. The name Angelo Bruno itself has become a kind of local folklore, a symbol of a time when a different set of rules governed the city, a time of quiet power and brutal enforcement. For the families of the victims, the legacy is one of unending grief and trauma. The wives, children, and friends of the dozens of men murdered in the endless power struggles were left to pick up the pieces, their lives forever altered by a violence they did not choose. Their legacy is the silent one, the pain that does not make headlines, but continues through generations. A reminder that the true cost of organized crime is paid not by the gangsters in their courtrooms or prison cells, but by the innocent lives shattered in the crossfire. For law enforcement and the justice system, the legacy of the Philadelphia mob is one of hard one victory and a blueprint for destruction. The investigations and prosecutions of the Bruno, Scarfo, and Merlino eras fundamentally shaped modern police work. The successful use of the Riso Statute in Philadelphia became a model for dismantling criminal enterprises across the country. From street gangs to international syndicates, the techniques refined in those battles, the cultivation of high-level informants, the strategic use of electronic surveillance, the patient, multi-year building of a conspiracy case are now standard procedure. The FBI agents and prosecutors who fought these battles left behind a playbook for defeating organized crime, a legacy of perseverance and intellectual rigor that continues to protect the public. For the American Mafia as a whole, the rise and fall of the Philadelphia family is a stark cautionary tale about the perils of instability and the futility of violence. The family became a national object lesson in what happens when the delicate balance of power is shattered. Bruno's murder sent a shockwave through the commission, demonstrating that even a sitting boss was not safe. Scarfo's reign of terror showed that unchecked violence was a suicide pact. The bloody civil war that followed proved that internal strife was a faster road to oblivion than any external threat. The Philadelphia story served as a warning to other families, a grim reminder that the old codes were fragile and that the path of least resistance often led directly to a federal penitentiary. And for Angelo Bruno personally, the legacy is one of tragic irony. The gentle Don, the man who valued peace and stability above all else, became the catalyst for one of the bloodiest periods in American organized crime history. His murder unlocked a Pandora's box of violence that his successors were neither wise enough nor strong enough to contain. He is remembered not for the peaceful empire he built, but for the chaotic inferno that consumed it after he was gone. His life stands as a testament to the idea that in the underworld, good intentions and a steady hand are no match for the primal forces of greed and ambition that forever lurk in the hearts of men. His story is a Shakespearean drama played out in the row houses and social clubs of South Philadelphia, a timeless narrative of a noble king betrayed by his own court, his death heralding a dark age from which his kingdom would never truly recover. And so, the final echoes of the shotgun blast that killed Angelo Bruno on that March night in 1980 have faded into history, leaving behind a silence that is itself the most powerful epitaph for the Philadelphia crime family. The story that began in the sun-drenched hills of Sicily traveled across the ocean to the promise of America and unfolded over 7 decades in the urban landscape of Philadelphia has reached its inevitable conclusion. The narrative arc is now complete, a tragic cycle that moved from the ordered, if criminal, peace of Bruno's reign through the explosive, self-immolating violence of the Scarfo era, the chaotic civil wars that followed, and finally, to the hollowed-out, spectral existence of the modern day, a ghost of its former self, perpetually watched and permanently diminished. The mighty has fallen, and it fell not with a single push, but from 1,000 self-inflicted wounds. The journey of this criminal organization serves as a profound and universal parable about the corrupting nature of power and the inescapable consequences of a path defined by betrayal and violence. It demonstrates with brutal clarity that no empire, whether legitimate or criminal, can long endure when it is built on a foundation of fear and held together by the fragile threads of loyalty that can be severed by a better offer or a bigger gun. The code of Omert, the very heart that once pumped life through this body, was the first organ to fail, poisoned by the very men who had sworn to uphold it. The downfall was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, agonizing unraveling, a predictable result of the internal rot that festered with each broken vow and each act of treachery. The legacy of this story is not one of glamour or honor, but one of wasted lives, wasted potential, and wasted loyalty. The men who walked this path, from the strategic Bruno to the psychopathic Scarfo to the charismatic Merlino, all shared the same destination, an early grave or a cold prison cell. The money, the power, the fear they commanded, all of it proved to be transient, illusory, leaving behind nothing but pain for their families and a dark stain on the city they called home. For us, the audience looking back on this history from a safe distance, the story of the Philadelphia mob is not just a thrilling tale of true crime, but a sobering lesson. It is a reminder that the pursuit of power through criminal means is a fool's gamble where the house always wins, and the price is always, ultimately, a human soul. The streets of South Philadelphia are quieter now. The social clubs are less ominous, and the shadow that once loomed so large over the city has receded. But the story remains, preserved in court transcripts, FBI files, and the memories of those who lived through it. A permanent warning etched into the city's soul. The era of the dominant American Mafia is over, a chapter closed by the relentless march of time and justice. The tale of Angelo Bruno, gentle dawn, and the bloody empire he built and lost is finished. We have reached the end of our journey. If you found this deep, detailed exploration of one of history's most fascinating criminal stories compelling, if you were captivated by the rise and fall of these complex and flawed figures, then your engagement is what makes this channel possible. Please support our continued effort to bring you the most thorough and engaging historical narratives by liking this video, subscribing to the channel for more content that delves into the forgotten corners of our past, and hitting the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Thank you for listening.